So, the very important part of the day. We come to our keynote presentation. A Good Society, the Importance of Education in Reducing Inequality. Professor Carmen Lawrence, Director of the Study of Social Change, School for Psychology, University of Western Australia. Professor Carmen Lawrence completed her PhD in Experimental Psychology at the University of Western Australia in 1983. Carmen then entered state and federal politics in 1988 was appointed Minister for Education. In 1990, Carmen became the Premier of Western Australia before entering the federal arena in 1994. Immediately on entering the House of Representatives, she was chosen to serve in the Keating Ministry and held the portfolios of Human Services and Health, as well as assisting the Prime Minister for Women's Interests until the government fell in March 1996. Carmen remained in Parliament until 2007 and then returned to academia at her alma mater. Carmen was on the recent Gonski Review panel, which reviewed the school funding. And it was wonderful also today to note that Carmen was the Education Minister during the period when two of our life members, Mrs Betty Green and Mr David Forrester, were on State Council. So it's lovely to see those things still going. I would like you all delegates to please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Carmen Lawrence.
The usual problem with lecterns. I apologise to the people near the front if you can't see my face. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a long time, in fact, since I've been to a WACSSO conference, probably since I was, in fact, Education Minister all those years ago. And I have to say, education remains a passion of mine, and it was one of the reasons I was so delighted to be invited to be part of the Gonski panel, because we certainly thought on the panel that it had the capacity to change the quality of the debate in Australia about the way we fund our schools and the way that our schools operate. But I want to take a step back from that, I suppose, to a preoccupation of mine that is long-standing, and that's the whole question of equality and inequality in Australia. I think it's a matter of history that a lot of our national institutions, including our education systems, were crafted out of a very pragmatic realisation that government action was needed to reduce the glaring inequalities that faced Australia at Federation. The end of the 19th century was a difficult time, and we became known as the wage earners' welfare state. And that was really regardless of the side of politics you came from. And perhaps as a result of this history, a lot of Australians actually do hold the view still that ours is a very equal society, an egalitarian society. But I have to say the evidence today shows that that remains more a hope than a reality. Not least because we've taken to imitating our English-speaking cousins in the United Kingdom and the United States, who do far less well than we do on almost every measure of equality. And as a result of that, I think we've muted a lot of the instruments we used to use to reduce inequality. There have been a lot of deliberate government policies in the post-war period that actually produced steady increases in economic equality, not just here but around the world. But that momentum stalled somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s, and then started to reverse under the influence of what some people call the neoliberal experiment, nothing to do with the Liberal Party necessarily. As a result, today, the wealthiest 20% of Australians own 61% of the nation's wealth. The poorest 20% own just 1%, and that is a backward step. Although the disparities in income are a bit less marked than those of wealth, they are also growing. And the interesting thing is most Australians don't appreciate that. The recent study showed that we still hold in our heads a model that shows we're a fairly equal society. And when you ask people what they want, they actually describe a distribution which is almost equal between the various segments of our society. And while our tax office is more vigilant than most, international data indicate that the global super rich, as they've come to be called, are exploiting deficiencies in cross-border tax rules, taking advantage of tax havens to hide a staggering $21 trillion offshore, not taxed, not available to the people of their countries, as much indeed as the American and Japanese GDPs combined. This level of leakage, as it's politely called, means that levels of inequality within societies that I'll talk about in a moment are likely to be significantly worse than these official estimates. While in Australia we are collectively wealthier than we've ever been, that wealth, as I indicated earlier, is spread a lot less evenly than it was in the 60s and 70s. And we're now a good deal less equal than countries, for instance, like Japan, Sweden, Norway. Indeed, we're one of the most unequal of the developed countries. We're down south, keeping company increasingly with the United States and Britain. Now, a lot of people don't regard this as a problem. For some, it's simply the way that the system works. And in some cases, to suggest otherwise is to mark you as a class warrior in inverted commas. And I would want to argue to the contrary that this is a big problem, and it's a big problem for all of us. I think we once understood on all political fronts, on both sides of politics, that allowing big gaps in income, in wealth and in opportunity to open up was inherently risky and potentially socially quite destructive. I think that was a view that was widely shared. And whatever the political motivation for seeking to reduce inequality in the post-war period, and the pull of communism might well have been one of those motivations, today's concern with growing inequality, when it's expressed at all, apart from references to Bruce Springsteen, is more likely to draw on international evidence that economic inequality, not the absolute level of income, but inequality, is associated with a long list of personal and social ills. The more unequal the society, including comparing developed rich countries, the longer the list. And that includes reduced life expectancy, high rates of mental illness, alcohol and drug abuse, and believe me, Australia stands out there. Increased obesity, higher crime and imprisonment rates, more school dropouts, and lower levels of educational performance. And all of those things cluster together. And for those people who are looking for some hints about what's behind Australia's cynicism toward politics, perhaps they could factor in the results from a recent study of the same 24 wealthy democracies, the OECD countries mainly, which showed that economic inequality is also associated with a reduced interest in politics and more negative views of government. So people, in a sense, retreat from activism of the kind that you demonstrate by being involved in WACSSO. Now, it's not clear how this inequality increases these problems, but studies confirm that the context in which we live affects the quality of our lives. We know that from a huge amount of work in psychology and sociology, and even indeed in evolution. I think we're primed by evolutionary history to be acutely attuned to even the slightest hints of unfairness. Just watch kids. You know very well how alert they are to any unfairness. And we're all like that. There's a lot of evidence that we thrive best in environments where we're treated as equals. We're all happier and healthier the more equal we are. It's perhaps less often commented upon, but inequality may actually act as a barrier to economic growth, which is, if you like, the touchstone for a lot of people, because the capabilities of the community, significant sections of the community, are underutilised. There's no doubt, in summary, that rising inequality, economic inequality of the kind I'm talking about, presents a real threat to our collective well-being, not just the well-being of those who are missing out. And importantly for education, the international comparisons also show that withdrawal of resources from the public to the private domain goes with rising inequality, whether it's health or education or social services. James Galbraith pointed out that inequality, as he puts it, may cause the comfortable to disavow the needy, resulting in what he described as a two-tiered society, where those on higher incomes live lives which are fundamentally different from the less well-off, with corresponding levels, as he put it, of mutual misunderstanding. And it's true around the world where there are big levels of inequality. People of affluence and people of modest means then lead increasingly separate lives. Depending on our wealth, we live, work, shop and play in different places and send our children to different schools. In Australia, I think it's fair to say these differences are often denied or minimised because they jar with our advertised commitment to the ethic of a fair go. But if you look at the evidence, it's there. It's important that at the same time as this economic equality has been on the rise, and it's very well documented now, so has educational inequality, the focus of the Gonski Review. Each feeds off the other in a cycle of ever-decreasing social mobility. It's no accident, I think, that the most unequal nations in the developed country league have the poorest educational results, spend less on education, and have the most segregated education systems. Recognition of this marked and increasing underperformance of children from disadvantaged backgrounds in Australia prompted the government to establish the review of school funding, of which, as I say, I was a member, and which, as you know, has reported. The very explicit brief that we were given was to devise a fairer funding framework for education, which would ensure that differences in children's achievements are not the result of differences in wealth, income, power or possessions. To some extent, as we saw it, the task was one of repair, to find a way to reignite that earlier momentum I talked about toward reducing the impact of social position on how well children do at school. One of the foundations of Australia was, after all, a demand for quality, publicly funded education for all, regardless of their means. And until relatively recently, Australian governments of all stripes had exhibited a strong commitment to a superior public education system, open to all and good enough to inspire the confidence of all parents and citizens, regardless of their wealth. The choice to send a child to a non-government school, certainly when I was growing up, was generally not made because government schooling was judged inferior. In the last 20 years, this commitment has looked increasingly fragile and the system more fragmented. And governments, I'd have to say, of all stripes again, have had a role in this deterioration, withholding the funds needed to repair flaking paint and down at heel and outdated school facilities, so parents making comparisons often made a poor one, orchestrating phony debates about values, remember that, and fingering government schools as deficient, elevating choice above equality, and failing to repudiate even the most extravagant media claims about school failure. I sat in the Parliament and listened to some of the appalling things that were said about government school and schools and government school teachers. A lot of us watched with dismay and objected as teachers in government schools were pilloried. As a result, I think, of this climate of opinion, and we saw the trends, more parents have withdrawn their children from government schools and the schooling system has become more segregated. The evidence is there, especially on the basis of parents' wealth and occupation. By international standards, I'm sure you know that Australia still has average to high standards of educational performance. There's always a lag with these inequality indicators, although there are recent signs that this is falling off, and we documented those in the Gonski report. But the interesting thing is that there are now big differences between the top and bottom performers in our school system. Finding a way to arrest and hopefully even reverse this deterioration was never going to be easy, of course. The Australian education system, as you know, is awash with, sadly, with special interests and fixed positions. And I suppose it's not surprising that most of us are fiercely protective of our own children's welfare. When I was Education Minister here in Western Australia, in what seems a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, the Director-General of Education reassured me that I was nearing the end of what to a novice minister seemed like an endless series of meetings. Today, those people that I might have met then would be called stakeholders, a word I hate. But then we actually knew them by name. WACSSO, for instance, would be introduced to me not as stakeholders, but as the representative of parents' organisations in Western Australia. The Esperanto Association always marked the end of introductory meetings, the DG said, and we've just made them an appointment to see you. It was a reminder, if I needed one, that a great many people, in fact probably everybody, cares deeply about education and wants to be heard. My own strong and continuing interest in education, and particularly equity, was fuelled, I think, in part, and I'm sure you have it too, by the enthusiasm my parents had for getting a good education, wanting to ensure that we 7 children had what they were denied because of their modest means. My father, like many of his generation, had to leave school at the end of primary school, which made it hard for me to tell him that some of what he was paying for, because I went to a private school, a Catholic school in the country, was not up to scratch. In fact, I envied the kids at the local state school. My experiences as Education Minister and the countless school visits I made while I was an MP also opened my eyes to the huge differences in resources and opportunity provided by schools in the public and sometimes the private systems. Add to that the passionate, and sometimes after a discussion on a Friday night that we have with my dad, one might say obsessional involvement of several members of my immediate family in education. And it was sort of inevitable that I would say yes when I was asked to be part of the Gonski Review, despite appreciating just how difficult the task was likely to be. And we certainly appreciate the support that's coming from all sectors, in fact, to get these recommendations implemented. Because the entrenched positions of many of the players, the heightened emotional tone that you get in debating differences between school sectors about funding shares and the complex nature of school systems and funding sources always mean that our deliberations were going to be testing and forensically monitored. For education watchers, there have been a feast of reports recently: the Gonski report, Richard Tease's report, which was commissioned by the state and territory governments on the state of education in Australia, the OECD report on equity, one of a series on the characteristics of high-performing school systems in the developed world. Worth a read if you go online and have a look. Underpinning all of these reports, a bit different from some in the past, was a deep-seated worry that despite many years of universal public education, there's still very substantial and in some cases, as I've said, increasing degrees of inequality in student achievement which result from entrenched disadvantage. All these reports, I have to say, had taken a systemic approach, emphasising differences in funding, in selection and segregation within school systems, rather than individual school failure. They weren't pointing to teacher training or teacher quality or parental commitment or any of those things, but rather saying, hang on guys, the way we fund education is important here, and the resources that go to assist all of these people, parents and teachers alike, are probably, if not at least as important, more important. As educator Chris Bonner wrote, while we have been looking almost exclusively at school practice, the wider framework problems have worsened. That gap has been getting wider. Rather, he suggests we should heed the international data and the OECD reports of system performance and focus on improvement in schools' policy as much as the practice within them. It's not to say that the practice within them is unimportant, but it isn't the only game in town. We were certainly on the panel intensely aware of all those international data that show absolutely clearly now, I think, that more equitable systems regularly achieve higher levels of performance for everybody. As the most recent OECD report emphasises, the evidence, they say, is conclusive. Equity in education pays off. The highest performing education systems across OECD countries are those that combine high quality, what goes on in the schools, and equity. While all of the reports that I mentioned acknowledge the importance of what happens in schools, things like teacher quality, innovative teaching practices, curriculum and so on, they also point directly to the need for changes to school policy and funding. So this is timely. Whether the current government or future governments, state and federal, implement the recommendations of Gonski, they cannot deny the evidence. And to the extent that they fail to respond to that evidence, those gaps that I talked about will widen and disadvantage will become even more entrenched. Richard Tease's report, which was actually scandalously withheld from public scrutiny until it was leaked, underlines the shift that's taken place in thinking, I think, amongst a whole range of bodies about the imperative for equal opportunity in education. I think a lot of people think, look, we open the school door, parents can come, there's no problem, everyone's equally entitled to an education. That very weak form of the idea of equality, a lot of people thought and still think perhaps that that's all that's required. But I think what's changed is that people now say, well, the accident, if you like, of a child's birth shouldn't limit their achievement, and that we should see the handicapping weights, if you like, that some children carry as they approach the school door. As Tease puts it, what we're seeing is a shift from success for some to success for all, a shift from accepting the big differences in achievement between different social groups as inevitable to trying to break down the barriers. And we see some countries doing it very well. And we see historically that we did it better than we are now. So it's not an impossible dream. Ensuring that the same standards and expectations are applied to all children, no matter what their parents' income or race or location. We explicitly endorse the view, and the language is a bit turgid, but I'll quote from the report, that the underlying talents and abilities of students that enable them to succeed in schooling are not distributed differently among children from different socioeconomic status, ethnic or language backgrounds, or according to where they live or go to school. So the outcome shouldn't reflect that either. This is not to say that we didn't recognise that children in these situations often enter school, as I say, at a marked disadvantage, but rather that school funding arrangements, the way schools are organised, should recognise the fact that there are differences as children approach the school door, perhaps because of disability or being Indigenous or being in a remote area or coming from a poor family background. But schools should be in a position to seek to minimise those differences rather than, in a sense, ignoring them and thereby amplifying them. That's the school funding system. Our panel's deliberations were informed by a comprehensive analysis of Australian children's achievement over time, as I say, and in comparison with other countries. But I have to say, those data we know are limited, and I know a lot of you have wondered about whether or not the NAPLAN testing focus, as it is narrowly, on a number of subject areas, doesn't tell the whole story. And we appreciate that it doesn't either, and a lot of what goes on in schools is not captured by those international and indeed national data. It only captures a narrow range of outcomes. But we had to work with what we had. And it was clear from all of those data that the link between student background and educational achievement is not only growing, but it's more marked in Australia than in other high-performing OECD countries. So the gap between top and bottom performers is growing. That's pulling down the aggregate performance of Australia. The gap between top and bottom is closely related to the position of parents, and that's, again, a growing problem. In 2009, the OECD noted that on average, differences in students' backgrounds accounted for some 55% of performance differences between schools, while the figure in Australia, that's the average for the wealthy countries with whom we compare ourselves, the average for Australia is 68%. While we do better than the US and the UK, that I've mentioned unfavourably before, we're not doing as well as many otherwise comparable countries. We should look to Canada and to Finland for examples. Some people look at this and they say, well, why should we care? That's just the way things are. Apart from the personal loss to the students, whose futures are unfairly constrained by poorer educational results than their better-off compatriots, the aggregate scores, I think interestingly for policymakers, show that 5 of the 6 countries that outrank Australia in those international comparisons, the PISA results in particular, are those who have higher equity in their school systems. In other words, the more equitable systems produce better results overall. And of note is the fact that the most recent results show that one of the reasons for the recent drop in our international ranking and poorer results in domestic tests appears to be the smaller number of children from advantaged backgrounds performing at the highest levels of proficiency. Performance at the top end has fallen too. Now, exactly why that happens is an interesting question, but maybe it has a bit to do with competition and the feeling of pressure, I don't know. A recent study by Chu of the performance of 15-year-olds from 41 countries on various achievement tests demonstrates this point, I think, very strongly. Students scored higher on the tests not only when they had access to more resources themselves, money and qualified teachers, but also when there was a more equal distribution and less of what the authors called privileged student bias, which they defined as occurring when privileged parents can use their superior socioeconomic capital to divert more educational resources to their children and away from the less well-off. And as I said, that's what happens increasingly in unequal societies. What they found, and again, this is not surprising, is that there were diminishing marginal returns. The extra money spent on the already well-off produced very little improvement overall. The same money delivered to poorer schools and less well-off children produced a very significant improvement in performance. Results like this led the panel to conclude, politely, that there was considerable scope for Australia to reduce the inequities in our schooling system, noting that a disproportionate number of students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds attend government schools, an imbalance that has been growing more marked. In the past, some of the disadvantaged students, whether it was because of disability or location or socioeconomic status, attended the independent schools, particularly in the Catholic sector, but that isn't happening to the same extent anymore. Of all students from the lowest quarter of socioeconomic disadvantage, almost 80% attend government schools. The drift of students and resources from government to non-government schools has accelerated in Australia in the last decade or so, although I did see some figures for WA that suggested it may have reached a bit of a plateau. But what's happened is that we have further concentrated wealthier students in the private sector and schools in more affluent areas and vice versa. The higher up the social scale, the greater the drift and vice versa. As a result, there are now more schools with very high proportions of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. I'm telling you something you know, but this is now demonstrated in a way that no government can ignore it. And they're mainly in the government system, and a high concentration of the most advantaged, mainly in the private schools. An education system like this, which siphons off children of the wealthier and better educated and privileged parents, inevitably is going to weaken both the energy and the funding base for the government system. The more parents remove their children from the public system, the more pressure is put on funding. And this is something that's not always realised. You'll hear arguments about parents in the private system saving the government money because that they're paying a proportion of the fees. The interesting thing is that when you set up new schools and there are already places available in the system, the total cost of education may in fact increase. The more pressure is put on funding, the unit costs of schooling escalate without any commensurate increase in quality, and that's certainly what we've seen over recent years. Resources which might have been used to provide for improved facilities and teacher support in existing schools are then diverted to setting up new school places. And while I won't mention the town, there's an example here in country Western Australia where over a period of years a local government high school, and it's particularly a problem in high schools, lost ground dramatically after 4 private schools were opened in the area. The most disadvantaged children were left behind, actually having fewer teachers per student than in the new private schools. The total cost of education in that community skyrocketed, and when you look at the actual performance, there was no aggregate improvement. So greater cost, no improvement in outcome. And this happens partly because Commonwealth and state governments are separately responsible largely for state and independent school systems, and we can't revisit that. But such decisions, like how many schools to open up in an area, are often made without reference to the cumulative impact on all schools. And that's why one of the recommendations in the Gonski report was to have joint planning so that it was possible for government, state and federal to take account of the existing school places rather than setting up a parallel system which, in a sense, siphoned off the children. In a system like the one we have, if we're not careful, and I think some people already have this perception at the secondary school level, it's likely that the public education system will be seen as the residual one, the one that children go to when they have no other choices available. And the task then of educating the most disadvantaged children is increasingly falling to the public sector, which has not been correspondingly resourced. So they've had a concentration of disadvantage without the resources. And part of what we recommended was that additional funds should flow to children on the basis of their initial disadvantage, whether by education or disability or being an Indigenous student or in a remote area, that all of those things should be taken into consideration. But more than that, where that disadvantage was concentrated, and a lot of people from backgrounds like that were at a school, that should trigger additional funds. The exact thresholds are ones for the governments to work out. And whether or not state governments follow that process, I guess in the end, is up to them. But I hope they will look closely at how they fund schools to deal with the most disadvantaged. When we ask the state governments, including this one, for data on, for instance, how they funded by socioeconomic status, how they funded by Indigenous status or remote area, it was very difficult to get precise figures, in fact close to impossible. And in the end, the data we had were opaque, to say the least. And I think that's something certainly that schools, perhaps through your organisation, can make greater demands of government to make sure we know exactly where these funds are going. I think we're at the stage where, as a community, we should demand that all students, regardless of their parents' wealth and education, should be able to benefit from being in school, and the status of their parents should make no difference to the capacity they have to fully, if you like, exercise their capacities. We know that you have to take account of disadvantage because a lot of students start behind the 8 ball when they come in through the door. But that's why it's all the more important to get this right. How schools can actually compensate, and I underline here, if you look at government schools' performance, despite the fact that they have, by and large, more children from disadvantaged backgrounds, they actually do as well as the private sector independent schools when you take account of that disadvantage. So they're holding their own in teaching those students, but because they're not able to overcome the additional disadvantages those students face, that gap is widening. Alexander's work, and I'll finish on this and we can have some questions if you're interested in that. Yes, but I think you probably would like to have some questions, so I won't speak for too much longer. Alexander's work in the US looked at what schools did for kids from various backgrounds. And he found that while at the beginning of the primary school career of these children, there were differences on the basis of parents' wealth. They weren't huge, but they were there. And remember this, in the US, this is in a public school system, children all being derived from pretty much the same area, no segregation, all in the same schools. And what they found was that that gap grew over the period that they were in primary school. And when they looked at it, they found that when the poor kids were in school, they actually outlearned the wealthier kids because they were a bit behind. So they had more, if you like, space to occupy. But at the end of the school year and to the beginning of the next, their performance dropped off. And the reason for this is obvious, that they didn't have those opportunities for enrichment that people of means often have, taking them to school camps, science exhibitions, galleries, music and so on, the things that people without means and perhaps without expectations for their children don't necessarily have. So that's one of the things that schools need to be able to do, is to provide for those enriching experiences for the less well-off and the less well-heeled, if you like, educationally. And when they do, they succeed spectacularly. That these children from the backgrounds, the impoverished backgrounds, as I say, outlearn the others once they get a chance in school. I have some very strong views too, which aren't captured in the Gonski report, about the direction in which we're headed in Australia on some other fronts, like putting Year 7s in secondary schools at the cost of $400 million in Western Australia. 400. Imagine what you could do with that. And the centralisation of curriculum. You know, if it's Tuesday, I'm caricaturing it a bit, but I mean, why do we need a centralised curriculum? We don't. State governments have been supine, I think, in accepting Commonwealth government directives on a lot of these fronts. The interesting thing is, if you make comparisons of the best school systems, they have a lot of local autonomy. The teachers are respected, they're required to have master's degrees, the children are educated almost from go to woe in the same school, they're not segregated systems, and so on. So I think we've been heading, as I say, in the direction that in some senses has been dictated by failing systems like the United States, where this obsession with measurement and league tables and paying teachers on the basis of their performance as if they operated individually have all become part of our discussion, despite the fact that just last year, the end of last year, beginning of this year, the assessment of that program in the United States showed dramatically what a failure it had been. And here we are adopting some of the same principles in our own school systems. So you guys have got a lot of work to do. And I think the critical thing for us is, in a sense, to realise that while schools can offset a lot of the impediments to children's education, they're not miracle workers, and they need the resources and the support to do it. They also need the policies which reduce disadvantage of their charges outside the school. So the growing inequality that we have in Australia and, as I say, social immobility are separate problems we need to address. The entire nation's well-being is compromised when young people are not able to participate fully in education or when their schooling is narrow and unsatisfying. For the individual, the costs of a poor education are enormous. But for the nation, the social costs of a divided society may be even greater. Thank you.